A man once sat across from me and said something that sounded simple on the surface, but it revealed almost everything that was wrong with the way he thought about money. He said, "I have a little over $100,000 and somehow I still feel broke." Most people would hear that sentence and immediately choose a side. Some would say he was ungrateful. Others would say he was proof that $100,000 is nothing in modern America. I thought something else. I thought he was standing at one of the most important thresholds in financial life and did not yet understand what kind of door was beginning to open in front of him. That is a very dangerous position, because $100,000 can become the foundation of a different kind of life, or it can vanish into the same old habits that kept a person dependent for years. What decides the outcome is almost never the size of the number alone. It is the meaning the owner assigns to the number. That is what I wanted him to understand. Not how to admire the number, not how to spend it, how to think with it. People destroy a great deal of financial potential because they misunderstand what money actually is. They treat it like a score or a badge or a permission slip or a mood regulator or a way to prove to the world that they are doing better than they used to. All of those uses are common. None of them are especially intelligent. Money in its highest form is stored choice. It is stored time. It is stored negotiating power. It is a claim on future freedom. The richer you become in money, properly understood, the less often you have to sell yourself at the first available price. That is what wealth really changes. It changes the level of urgency in your life. It changes how quickly you must say yes. It changes how much nonsense you are forced to tolerate. It changes whether a bad month is an inconvenience or a crisis. That is why I have always found the phrase net worth a little too sterile for what is really happening. The true question is not only how much a man owns. The true question is how much breathing room his capital has purchased. A person with a high income and no breathing room is not rich in the way that matters. He is expensive. That is different. I learned this lesson by watching people with impressive incomes live like hostages. One of the saddest financial spectacles in America is the high earner who has built an expensive cage and now mistakes the cage for success. He lives in the right zip code, drives the right car, pays the right school tuition, keeps the right vacations alive, knows the right restaurants, carries the right monthly obligations. And because the outside world admires the costume, he begins to believe the structure underneath it must be strong. Often it is not. I knew a man years ago who earned far more than the average worker ever would. His salary made people listen when he spoke about money. That alone should make you suspicious. Income is one of the least reliable signals of actual financial intelligence. This man made enough to impress nearly everyone around him. He also needed every dollar. His mortgage was huge. The car payments were absurd. His household expenses had expanded into every available space. He had become one of those modern Americans who are applauded constantly and free almost never. If his income stopped, the panic would begin quickly, not in theory in days. He was not wealthy. He was merely highly paid. That distinction matters more than most people understand. At the same time, I knew another man who made far less. From the outside, he did not look like a candidate for financial confidence. Smaller apartment, older car, no status theater, less social shine, and yet the structure of his life was stronger. His fixed expenses were lean. His obligations were deliberate. His cash stayed where it was put. He had room. When opportunities appeared, he could move. When stress arrived, he bent instead of breaking. The first man had a larger income. The second man had more optionality. I know which one I prefer. Optionality is one of the finest assets in the world because it multiplies the value of your judgment. Good judgment without options is frustrating. Good judgment with options becomes powerful. That is why I say $100,000 matters so much. Not because it makes anyone rich in the theatrical sense, because it often marks the point where money stops being only storage and begins becoming force. Below that level, a person can save and invest and still feel as though almost the entire project is being carried on his back. He contributes, he works, he postpones, he does the right thing. But the account is still too small to feel like a second engine. That is the emotionally thankless stage. The public underestimates how brutal that stage can be. They think the hard part is not having money. Sometimes the hard part is having enough to see the beginning of a better life, but not yet enough to feel its power in daily decisions. That is where many people quit. They do not always quit theatrically. Sometimes they simply start using the money for things the old version of them wanted. A bigger car, a better apartment, a symbolic vacation, a renovation that flatters the ego, a purchase designed to look like they have arrived. That is how $100,000 becomes a story instead of a system. I never liked that use of capital. If I have $100,000, I do not want to ask first what I can buy with it. I want to ask what kind of machine it can become. That is the way I have always looked at capital. A dollar sitting idle is a passenger. A dollar working in a sensible system becomes an employee. $100,000, treated correctly, is not a pile of spending power. It is a small factory. And the day a person begins to see it that way, his life starts changing in ways that go well beyond the arithmetic. I told that man across the table that his problem was not the number in the account. His problem was the code in his mind. He had learned to think about money in the same way most people do. He measured it emotionally. He measured it socially. He measured it against the cost of things he could now buy. That is childish accounting. A serious owner asks different questions. How much of my life can this protect? How much income can this base produce over time? How much uncertainty can this absorb? How much better can I negotiate if I no longer feel immediate pressure? Those are adult questions. The answers are rarely glamorous. They are much more valuable than glamour. Now, let me explain why $100,000 functions like a threshold and not just another round number. In the beginning, saving is linear. You work, you set some money aside, you repeat. The machine is simple and blunt. Your labor does almost all the work. That is why the early years feel so lopsided. You carry the weight and the capital contributes almost nothing emotionally visible. $10,000 invested at a reasonable rate does not change many lives immediately. It may earn something, it may grow, but it does not yet alter the psychology of the household. $100,000 begins to change that at 8%, which is not guaranteed in any one year, but is a reasonable long-run framing device for broad productive assets. $100,000 throws off $8,000 a year. That is not enough to retire on. It is enough to matter. It covers real bills. It absorbs real strain. It proves the machine is no longer only theoretical. That proof is more important than people realize. The moment an account becomes large enough for the returns to be noticed in real life, a person's relationship to labor changes. Not because he can stop working, because he no longer feels that all relief must come from labor alone. A new source of force has entered the picture. That is what makes $100,000 a phase change below it. You are mostly accumulating. Above it, you are beginning to compound in a way you can feel. The distinction is subtle in the spreadsheet and enormous in the mind. I learned long ago that the mind matters as much as the calculator. A rich inner model of money produces better behavior. A weak inner model destroys even decent arithmetic. That is why so many people can earn well and stay financially frightened. They still think like laborers renting out time instead of owners building stored choices. Now, once you understand this threshold, the next question becomes obvious. What is the job of that first $100,000? And here I become very firm. Its job is not to impress anyone. Its job is not to fund relief spending. Its job is not to reward you for finally being disciplined. Its job is to become untouchable productive capital. That sentence makes some people uncomfortable because they have spent so many years depriving themselves that the moment they reach a visible milestone, their brain begins demanding a ceremony. The brain says you have earned something and you have earned a stronger future, not a self-congratulatory purchase. That is an important difference. The first $100,000 is sacred in a way later. Money is not. Later money comes into a life that already has a functioning engine beneath it. The first serious capital base creates the engine. If you interrupt it too early, you do not merely delay consumption. You delay the whole compounding phase of life. That cost is usually invisible because people see only the purchase they made, not the years they postponed. I have always cared deeply about hidden costs. The visible cost of a luxury vacation is one number. The hidden cost is what that capital would have become if left inside the freedom system. The visible cost of a newer vehicle is one number. The hidden cost is the yield, the optionality, and the psychological strength you surrendered in exchange for a machine that depreciates while pretending to raise your status. People rarely calculate these things honestly. If they did, many of them would spend very differently. I think about spending in categories, not because categories are intellectually exciting, because categories expose what money is really being asked to do. Some spending is pure consumption, gone after the experience ends. Some spending preserves the current machine, transportation that genuinely supports work, basic health costs, insurance that protects against catastrophic disorder, and some spending enlarges the machine, education that raises earnings, tools that increase productivity, assets that produce income, capital that compounds. The trouble with modern life is that most people blur these categories until the whole picture becomes sentimental and confused. They call consumption self-care. They call lifestyle inflation normal progress. They call expensive habits necessities. And they call purchases investments when what they really mean is they hope the purchase will make them feel less anxious or more admired. That is no way to allocate capital. Capital deserves a harder mind than that. If freedom is the objective, then the question must be ruthless. Does this dollar leave me with more optionality than I had before, or less? That is the filter. Not does it feel deserved. Not will other people understand it. Not can I technically afford it. Afford is one of the sloppiest words in the language. Many people can afford a thing in the sense that the bank will not stop them and the monthly cash flow can be bent to accommodate it. That does not mean the purchase is intelligent. It may simply mean the system can survive one more burden. I am not interested in whether a person can survive a purchase. I am interested in whether the purchase increases or decreases freedom. That is a far better standard. There is another model I like because it removes fantasy from the conversation. I call it the freedom number. Others have similar ideas under different names, but I do not care what you call it as long as you understand its seriousness. Take your annual spending, not the spending you imagine in a perfect world, your real spending. Then ask how much capital would be required to produce that spending at a prudent withdrawal or return assumption without running the system recklessly. If you need $40,000 a year to live a lean, satisfying life, and you want to assume a 4% real withdrawal framework, you need about $1 million. If you need $30,000, you need less. If you insist on $80,000 because your lifestyle structure has become swollen, your freedom number becomes much larger. This is one reason I say expense discipline matters more than people think. Increasing income is useful, sometimes essential, but reducing the cost of your life changes the size of the target directly. That is extraordinarily powerful. A person who lowers his real spending need is not merely becoming frugal. He is shrinking the amount of capital required to buy back his time. That is not a lifestyle preference. That is structural intelligence. This is why I have always smiled a little when people ask only how to make more money. It is an incomplete question. The harder and more profitable question is this: what kind of life am I building that will require so much money to feel safe? You can spend decades chasing a larger income while quietly enlarging the amount you need to feel calm. That is a very foolish race. Many households win it beautifully and still lose the larger game. That is why I tell people not to confuse cash flow with sovereignty. A big salary is not sovereignty. A low burn rate plus productive capital is much closer. The reason $100,000 matters is that it gives you your first real taste of this logic. if the number is protected, if the expenses are sane, if the capital is deployed reasonably, if the owner does not confuse reaching the threshold with permission to celebrate through consumption, then the relationship between time and money begins to shift. The investor feels less naked. The worker feels less cornered. The whole system gains a little dignity. This is where the market's role enters the discussion. I do not pretend there is some mysterious secret route most people are missing. For the overwhelming majority of ordinary households, the right answer is some version of broad, low-cost, productive ownership. Simple, diversified, boring enough to survive the ego. If a person with under $1 million is constantly searching for some brilliant active edge, I become nervous. The energy is usually misplaced. The greatest edge at that stage is behavior. High savings rate, low costs, consistent investing, long runway, low drama, a broad market fund, a sensible tax, aware structure, automatic contributions, and enough reserve liquidity outside the market to prevent forced selling will outperform a shocking amount of supposedly sophisticated behavior simply because the owner can stay with it. That matters. The best system is not the one that looks smartest on a message board. It is the one you will still own intelligently after a bad year, a flat year, and a frightening year. Durability is undervalued in every part of life. It is wildly undervalued in investing. Now let me say something about automation, because I do not trust motivation very much. Motivation is weather. Systems are infrastructure. People who say they will save what is left at the end of the month are usually handing the month permission to take everything. The future should be paid first, not sentimentally, mechanically. Money should move before the mind has a chance to invent a better use for it. That is how you beat the tired version of yourself. I have enormous respect for the tired version of a person because I have watched him ruin many otherwise intelligent plans. The tired version wants convenience. The stressed version wants comfort. The insecure version wants signaling. The lonely version wants reward spending. The anxious version wants to prove life is going somewhere by buying evidence of progress. Those versions of a person should not be in charge of capital allocation. The structure should decide before those moods arrive. That is why I like automatic transfers so much. Income arrives. A fixed percentage disappears into the freedom system. No discussion, no monthly heroics, no self-congratulation, just motion. If I were advising a younger person trying to reach the first $100,000 as fast and sanely as possible, I would tell him to treat savings rate like a lever, not a virtue signal. 20% is respectable. 30 is stronger. 40 changes the timeline dramatically if the life structure can tolerate it. This is where people say such rates are impossible. Often they mean emotionally difficult, not mathematically impossible. Many people have built lives that make higher savings rates painful because the whole architecture of their spending is designed to affirm identity rather than support freedom. That can be changed. Not always instantly, often very profitably. A smaller apartment, an older vehicle, fewer recurring luxuries, more deliberate social spending, less convenience theater. The culture hates this kind of talk because the culture is sponsored by consumption. But the mathematics do not care what the culture prefers. The mathematics reward retained capital. I once looked at two households that earned different incomes but had almost identical capacities to reach $100,000 quickly. The higher earning household had so much lifestyle drag that every raise disappeared into the machine. The lower earning household lived on a much cleaner structure. The savings rate, not the salary headline, told the truth. That is why I respect the savings rate so much. It reveals whether income is being converted into stored freedom or dissolved into maintenance of the present. Now, because people are human, comparison enters the picture and begins to poison judgment. This is one of the great hidden taxes in modern life. A person trying to build capital sees peers buying homes, upgrading kitchens, leasing nicer cars, posting better vacations, and narrating all of it as normal adulthood. If he is not careful, he begins to measure his own life against their visible spending rather than his own invisible strengthening. That is very expensive. Comparison is especially dangerous because it asks you to join a game whose scoreboard is external and whose costs are private. The public sees the car. It does not see the reduced optionality. The public sees the neighborhood. It does not see the longer freedom timeline. The public sees the wedding, the furniture, the upgraded phone, the stylish life. It does not see the smaller reserve, the weaker balance sheet, the delayed compounding, or the private anxiety. This is why I prefer people who can tolerate looking ordinary while getting stronger. That is a rare and profitable temperament. The person who cannot tolerate looking ordinary is usually destined to remain more fragile than necessary, because money will keep being recruited to support an image instead of a system. $100,000 means very different things to those two temperaments. To the status-driven person, it looks like purchasing power to the freedom. Driven person, it looks like an operating base. That is the fork in the road. I would choose the base every time. There is another point I want to make because it is emotionally difficult and financially important. The first $100,000 is often the point at which risk should become more strategic, not more emotional. Below that level, one bad decision can do disproportionate damage. Above it, you finally have enough base that you can think more intelligently about deploying small slices toward higher upside opportunities, if you truly understand them. But even here, the main use of the threshold is not speculation. It is dignity. It is the right to stop thinking like a person with no margin. I want a person with $100,000 to become calmer, not more theatrical, because the best use of an early capital base is not excitement. It is optionality. Optionality means you can say no, you can wait, you can study, you can recover from a mistake without returning to zero, you can negotiate from less fear, you can take a thoughtful risk in work or life without feeling one unlucky event away from collapse. That is one of the most beautiful things money can buy, and almost nobody sells it properly because the industry makes more money selling aspiration than optionality. Aspiration is flashy. Optionality is quiet. Optionality is also what changes lives. Now, let me address a common objection because it sounds compassionate and is often sloppy. People say life is short. Enjoy it now. I do not reject the first sentence. Life is short. That is precisely why I want people to buy back years of it rather than rent out all of it to support consumption habits they barely enjoy after a few. The research on happiness has been fairly clear for a long time. Beyond a certain level, more consumption does not keep producing proportional increases in well-being. What does matter enormously is autonomy. Control over time, reduced financial stress, the ability to leave a corrosive environment, the ability to care for your body, your relationships, your curiosities, and your inner life without every decision being subordinated to next month's obligations. That is what capital buys when used well. So when someone says enjoy it now, I want to ask which version of enjoyment he means, the brief excitement of spending or the deeper enjoyment of a life with less coercion in it. I know which one I value more. That does not mean living like a monk. It means understanding a $5,000 vacation is not just $5,000. It is what that $5,000 might become inside the freedom system. If the number stays invested at a reasonable return for decades, it becomes much more than $5,000. It becomes part of the stream that may one day buy back your mornings. That is the true comparison. Not price versus pleasure in isolation, present pleasure versus future sovereignty. This is how adults should think about spending, not neurotically, rationally. Every dollar gets a job. What job does this dollar do better than the alternatives available to it? If the answer is real joy, real relationship, real restoration, that can be good spending. If the answer is signaling, mood management, or participation in a status script you do not even fully believe, then the dollar has probably been recruited badly. I have seen people make tremendous progress the moment they stop moralizing money and begin classifying it. Consumption, preservation, appreciation. Where is the dollar going? What is it doing when it gets there? Most people do not know that ignorance is. There is one final thing about the first $100,000 that I consider almost sacred. The principal must be protected from casual invasion. This is where many promising households ruin their own momentum. They build the capital base. Then life presents an emergency. Maybe a real one. Maybe a socially respectable one. Maybe a disguised convenience upgrade that sounds mature enough to justify pulling from the account. A little comes out, then a little more. Then suddenly the base is back at 85,000, then 78, and the whole timeline has been quietly reset. The math does not care about your reasons. It compounds only what remains. That is why I think of the first serious capital base as a one-way door. Money goes in. It is not invited back out for lifestyle drift. Not because I enjoy severity, because the machine needs integrity. Once the machine is mature, later money has more flexibility. The first serious base does not. That is the seedbed. You do not dig it up every time you want reassurance that you are allowed to enjoy life. Build a separate life for enjoyment. Do not use the freedom system as a vending machine. That is one of the best rules I know. If you follow it, a remarkable thing happens. Stress starts to decline. You sleep differently. Your relationship to work changes. A rude boss becomes less terrifying. A job transition becomes less catastrophic. A good opportunity becomes easier to say yes to because you do not need immediate certainty the way fragile people do. I have seen this transition many times. The outer life may look only modestly different. The inner life changes a great deal. And that is the real proof that money is finally doing what money should do. It is no longer only sitting, it is creating. This is why I have never admired money that is only displayed. Displayed money is often weak money. Strong money is usually quiet. It sits in structures that reduce fear, increase patience, and make better decisions possible. Strong money may drive an old car for a while. Strong money may live below its social rank. Strong money may look boring to people who understand almost nothing. That is fine. Protection and sane treatment. So if you are standing at or approaching $100,000 today, I would ask you to stop thinking of it as a purchase pool and start thinking of it as a threshold of adulthood in finance, not final adulthood. The first real one, the point where you can finally decide whether your capital will serve the old emotional patterns or the newer mathematical future. One road keeps you dependent but better decorated. The other begins the long process of buying back your life. I know which road I would take, and I know this too. The people who understand $100,000 correctly are usually the ones who later understand $1 million correctly too. Because the habits that build the first real capital base are usually the same habits that make later wealth durable. The numbers change. The underlying logic does not. Treat money as stored choice. Keep expenses from becoming a prison. Feed the system before the month gets its vote. Automate what should not depend on mood. Protect the principle. Ignore the status race. And remember that freedom is not a luxury item you purchase at the end of life. It is a structure you build piece by piece, threshold by threshold, long before the world notices what you are doing. That is what $100,000 really is, not proof that you are done. Proof that the machine can finally begin.